Apple pie. One of those who escaped the 1665 plague in London was Isaac Newton. He retreated to the country, where he sat under a tree and an apple fell on his head. He simultaneously invented gravity, apple crumble, and concussion. In 1687, he published Principia Mathematica, which contains his theory of gravitation and his famous three laws of motion. The most famous one is, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. These rules do not apply on social media, where for every action there is an unequal and opposite overreaction. What was radical about Newton's ideas was the underlying thesis that the laws of physics, rather than, or as well as, the laws of God, governed the universe. Newton went on to develop theories about optics, mathematical calculus, the binomial theorem, and an approximation of pi. Newton, like Galileo, was a devout Christian, albeit a slightly unorthodox one. He denied the doctrine of the Trinity, but believed devoutly in the Second Coming, and made dense mathematical calculations based on the dimensions of Solomon's Temple. Gravity explains the motions of the planets, he said, but it cannot explain who set the planets in motion. God governs all things, and knows all that is or can be done. But Newton had set other things in motion, to coin a phrase. Geologists began to argue that the world was far older than the account in Genesis allowed for. The English philosopher John Locke was a champion of reason and argued for reasonable Christianity. No mystical mumbo-jumbo, no blind faith in church authorities. Everything had to be tested. Locke believed in God, and he defended religious freedom too, except obviously for Catholics and atheists, both of whom he considered utterly unreasonable. Dei-o. Ideas of reason and scientific inquiry were chipping away at doctrinal certainty. But even those who jettisoned traditional Christianity were not prepared to jettison religion. The result was Deism, which was sort of a general worship of common sense. Deism held that reason was true religion, or the heart of true religion anyway. All the other ones had branched off into various kinds of superstition. Miracles and all those things were rather vulgar bits of folklore. Virtually all the church's historic doctrines were inventions. Religious ceremonies were just silly. There was God, there was basic morality, and we should acknowledge God's existence and worship him, and, well, that was it really. Deism was a bit of an upper-class hobby, but it was taken up by a Frenchman, François Arouet. We know Arouet better by his pen name, Voltaire. His book, Letters on the English, was published in 1734 and praised English tolerance. An Englishman, as one to whom liberty is natural, may go to heaven his own way, he wrote, in a very strange French accent. The book was immediately banned in France, largely on account of praising the English, but Voltaire became a famous and prolific author, publishing everything from plays to history. He was a champion of all the values that became associated with the Enlightenment: reason, free speech, skepticism, wearing wigs, taking snuff, and so on. He mocked Catholicism for all kinds of things, its love of the scriptures, and its hatred of the Jews who wrote them, for promoting a God who craves worship and punishes doubt, for preaching the love of your neighbour while hating your neighbour for his opinions. For Voltaire, traditional non-rational Christianity was crowd control, a method of commanding the masses and ensuring their obedience. If God did not exist, he wrote, it would be necessary to invent him. Deists believed in God, just not the kind of God that Orthodox Christians did. Mission impossible. In 1712, Abraham Jordan proudly showed off a new invention, which he called a swelling organ. Naturally, people flocked to the church of St. Magnus the Martyr to see it, only to be disappointed to find out it was really just a musical instrument with a volume control. Talking of swelling, in China, things had gone so well for the Jesuit missionaries that there was now an official Chinese bishop and liturgy and hundreds of thousands of baptized Catholics. But back home, suspicion still lingered over Ricci's rather liberal accommodation of traditional Chinese ways within Chinese Catholicism. Eventually, the Pope stepped in and forbade any use of Confucian terms and the veneration of ancestors. The result was a disaster. The Emperor expelled any cleric or missionary who followed the orders of the Pope, whom he saw as an enemy emperor. The Catholic Church in China withered and died. Meanwhile, in Japan, the rulers were getting ever more paranoid about foreign influences. In 1622, 51 Christians were killed in an attack on a church. In the persecution that followed, missionaries were burnt at the stake, and native converts executed in the most horrible ways. Some were crucified or boiled alive. But the Japanese, like the Romans, found that these martyrdoms actually impressed people with the courage of the Christians. So they took to torturing Christians into submission. By the end of the century, Christianity had virtually disappeared, or been driven underground, and Japan had retreated into isolation. Up until now, Protestant interest in overseas missions had been, non-existent really. It also heralded a sea change in Protestant attitudes towards overseas mission. Luther had more or less ignored overseas mission, choosing to believe that the missionary command had been carried out in apostolic times. But increasingly, as Protestantism became a settled faith, missionaries went out to all parts of the world. In 1698, the Anglicans formed their own propagandists in the form of the SPCK, the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. 3 years later, a different group formed the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, 1701. Initially, the aim of the SPG was to support the colonists in America, but then they expanded their vision to include the evangelization of slaves and Native Americans. Missionaries started to go from Europe to America, and among them were two brothers, John and Charles Wesley. Heartburn. The travelling Wesleys had a terrible time in America on their first mission trip. The Wesleys' foray into mission ended in scandal. John tried to seduce a young woman. Her family tried to have him arrested. He had to flee. But the journey itself proved to be crucial, because on the trip, John Wesley, 1703 to 91, came into contact with Moravians. These, as the name implies, came from Moravia, and were loyal followers of Jan Hus. They had been driven out of their homeland, and in 1722, a group sought asylum on the lands of one Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf. He became their leader, and let's face it, if your name was Nicholas von Zinzendorf, you'd be leader. They formed a community, a bit like a Protestant monastery with only women. So, Protestant monastery only with women, and without the head shaving and celibacy. They also sent missionaries to North and South America, to Greenland and the West Indies, and to heathen lands like England and Germany. Deeply pious, in America, these old-school radical Christians scandalized everyone, preaching to everybody, regardless of racial distinctions. They believed in the heart rather than head religion. Abstract theology was rejected in favour of emotion and feeling. God, they preached, cared for each individual as a person. All individuals, therefore, had to make a commitment, had to ask Christ to enter their hearts. The Moravians first came to John Wesley's attention when he noticed that they weren't screaming. The boat had got caught in a storm, and all the English started panicking, but the Moravians stayed calm and carried on with their service. These people had a kind of certainty that Wesley lacked. While he was in America, he met with the leader of the Moravians, Spangenberg, who asked him a very powerful and personal question. Did Wesley really know Jesus Christ? And was he really saved? Once back in London, Wesley spent more time with the Moravians. He began to see that he had an intellectual, rational belief in God, but nothing in the gut, no heartfelt faith. Then, on the 24th of May, 1738, he went, very unwillingly, to a Moravian meeting when, listening to the preacher, about 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. It was not that his hot water bottle had burst. It was that he suddenly felt that I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. So here's a fact file on John Wesley. Name John Wesley, aka not applicable. Nationality English. Dates 1703 to 91. Appearance shortish, strong, probably bandy-legged due to the fact that he rode a reputed 250,000 miles during his preaching career. Before he was famous, a student and a failed missionary, famous for founding Methodism and being warm-hearted. Why does he matter? Methodism was all about a personal experience of Jesus. Wesley was a superb preacher, but he was also a great organizer. Thousands of people joined his small groups, and he appointed itinerant, unordained preachers. Could he have a drink with them down the pub? Yes, but he'd probably start preaching to the bar staff.